This is a quick question as you're collecting the cards for Bill. Bill, I've done several training sessions for veterinary sort of farm and fleet store type operations, and this question keeps coming up every single time. Who's responsible for a producer coming in with a VFD filled out to make sure that the veterinarian has a license in the state where the animals are at? Because the farm and fleet stores are really struggling with the sort of logistics of that management. Can you help us there?
Well, I think that to generalize that question, I guess it's the question of what's the responsibility for a feed manufacturer in terms of verifying, I think, the information that's required to be on the VFD form, or to verify other information about the veterinarian that's authorizing the use. So I think there is not an expectation that a feed manufacturer or feed supplier, that there's an expectation that they're going to do some type of verification on, verifying that, the licensure of a veterinarian. Clearly, it's the veterinarian's responsibility that if they're issuing a order, that order is only a valid order if they are, in fact, an appropriately licensed veterinarian.
Other questions from the audience? Here's one for Dr. Michael Murphy or Dr. Bill Flynn. When writing VFDs as a veterinarian, what measures should be placed on the VFD in terms of concentration, grams per ton, or dose, milligrams per head, and what will be the required from FDA inspectors?
So how we've been responding to that is that the fact is that many of the products there's products that have been on the market for many, many years. How the dosing is described on those labels does vary in terms of the sort of units and whether it's portrayed or expressed in milligrams per kilogram or milligrams per head per day or grams per ton. Ultimately, what we're asking is, because the VFD form or order is information that the feed manufacturer will need to use in order to prepare the feed, that we're asking that the veterinarian, when they fill out the form, that they put the dose in the context of an inclusion rate, meaning, say, grams per ton, because that's the amount, the concentration that the feed manufacturer will ultimately need in order to prepare that feed. So in some cases, that information is in fact on the labeling of the product. If not, there is information available out there in terms of, and which we've provided this to folks, that there's conversion tables that can be used to basically convert, say, milligrams per head per day into a grams per ton, so that information can be placed on the VFD form.
Okay, thank you. Constance, do you think having producers involved in developing metrics is important? If so, how would you get them to buy in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you don't have the producers involved in developing the metrics, you're not going to fully account for some of the on the farm issues and challenges that may be in collecting those particular metrics. You're also going to have an inconsistent return of information if you don't have the buy-in from the producer. I think one of the things is I really like some of the approaches to trying to incentivize the particular practices and use. I like the idea of doing a simultaneous exploration of alternatives to antibiotics. The one thing that's really tough is when you take a tool away from producers, but you don't have something else that can kind of come in to fill that void. So those are two kind of important pieces to that. One of the very things we're trying, at the Farm Foundation do on a regular basis, is bringing together into a room people who don't necessarily like each other. And so what we're going to focus on doing is trying to pull the different groups in and actually sit down and talk about how do we get there. You know, I think at the end of the day, farmers understand the issue. Farmers and producers are concerned as parents and users of antibiotics themselves about the development of resistance. So I think it's going to take a lot of conversations. I think it's going to take listening to their different issues, as FDA and APHIS has done an excellent job of so far, of really kind of listening to those concerns, addressing those concerns, and trying to find a way to account for that. You know, we'd love to sit down with some of the major producer groups and visit with them about that as well.
Okay, thank you. Categorically, we have a number of questions in the same realm, and so this one has to do with enforcement. Who, if anybody, is responsible for calculating? Oh, wait, that's a different one, sorry. Oh, wait. It is about policing it, and you know, who's going to enforce the VFD, understanding that there may not be enough boots on the ground to follow each manufacturer, distributor. Any plans to engage state agencies?
Yes. So, you know, FDA does work closely with state agencies and has for years in terms of the work it does as far as compliance or inspectional activities. And so, you know, historically FDA has, you know, given its role in terms of feed safety, you know, has worked with states and leveraged resources at the state level to conduct periodic, feed mill inspections. So clearly, one element of, you know, the VFD is clearly feed manufacturers are one of the key parties involved in that sort of transaction, so to speak, in terms of a vet issuing a VFD order to a, you know, for a producer and you know, sending that through a feed manufacturer. And so as part of, you know, our envision, you know, what we envision is that we're working towards incorporating the sort of VFD element into our feed compliance program, and expect that as part of that activity, you know, we would be looking at, you know, essentially it's a records issue in terms of looking at VFD records. All the parties involved, the producer, the veterinarian, and the feed distributor, all are obligated to maintain the records on the VFD. So certainly that's one element of it, and we have been already working on that. We have an inspectional tool that we've been working on and sort of piloting out there in the field already on you know, looking at the VFD again as part of our you know, regular feed inspection activities.
Okay. We have a couple of questions relative to Extralabel use. This one, what is? Okay. Yes.
So the natural follow-up question to the one that was just answered then is, when you find non-compliance, what are the penalties or fines? Because that is a general question that is being asked on farms around the country. Thank you.
So on that point, I think certainly as we move into January, our primary focus, even, you know, with respect to our inspectional activities, is on education. So I think, you know, the inspectors that are out there and the instructions we're giving to them certainly is to focus on making sure that folks understand what the new requirements are. And so clearly our initial phase here for some period of time, going beyond, you know, into the next year, is going to be on education. So we're not, you know, again, expecting to run out and be, you know, penalizing folks right out of the gate because there may be a compliance issue. So I think that really is our focus, that we understand these are, you know, these are some significant changes, and there's a learning curve. There's going to be a period of adjustment that is going to need to happen, and we're making sure that message is getting to our field inspectors.
Yes.
And I asked last year, and I have that question again this year from the producers and the veterinarians. So come January 1st, there will be over-the-counter label products on the farms. Will the veterinarian be able to relabel those products, are the vendors, the feed stores willing to take those products back and credit? Because some people I know hoard, but how will you manage, or how will we tell veterinarians to manage that logistics of that date where it transfers?
And that also goes along with the question we have here that says, what about inventory? Will they have to re-tag all the bags in inventory in the feed stores?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's some, challenging inventory transition issues that we have to get past, not only as it relates to the medicated feed products, but also to the water products as well. And so clearly our objective is that as of January 1, all of those products that are affected that will become either VFD or prescription after January 1, that our goal is that those products are being used under the oversight of a veterinarian. We understand that on January 1 at stroke of midnight, clearly there's going to be a variety of products in different places and distribution channels, and recognize that those have to work through the process. Clearly, in the years leading up to this, we've been working with the industry to try to work through strategies for addressing that inventory issue as best as possible. But even under the best of circumstances, clearly there's that inventory issue that has to be worked through. So, again, to my earlier comment that our initial focus in terms of compliance is one on education. We understand that there's a transition period, and so long as folks are using due diligence to kind of do the right thing, that they're talking to their veterinarian, that they're making sure that the products they're using, January 1 and beyond, that are now legally designated as prescription or VFD, that they use due diligence to get those under the oversight of a veterinarian. And we recognize that we got to work through that transition period, and so I think that's really the best I can say at this point. And again, it is a challenge, and we're just going to have to work through it.
Okay. Constance, one for you. There's a concern about the anti-science wave, which appears to be overtaking popular thinking. How do you propose that we can counter that seemingly pervasive or prevailing attitude about science?
Is this a forum on antibiotic use, or is this no, I'm kidding. That was a joke. That's a big question.
Yeah.
Sorry. My humor has not been working with you guys all afternoon. So, no, that's a really difficult one. And it's one that, quite frankly, I think all of us have been wrestling with in the last several years. I think in this particular case, there are organizations out there that are interested in finding a solution. And I think one of the things that we really need to probably think more broadly about is how do we actually talk to those individuals and come together and identify where the common solution space is. And quite frankly, those organizations and those groups that are putting forward a position that really you never will find a solution space, we have to just kind of move past them. It's all about trying to solve the problems that facing in the food and ag system. And I think that there are a lot of those organizations that you'd probably be surprised. I've been running around the country meeting with a lot of groups that in my previous life I never would have sat down and talked with, only to find that there are some common goals and common objectives, and it's not going to end anytime soon. I mean, we're in this for the long haul, and it's kind of scary to think that there's so much scientific illiteracy in the country, but especially for a society that is so dependent upon science. So that will be a constant challenge. But we also have to make sure that when we support a position, a scientific position, that it is a position that there has been strong consensus on, so that we maintain our own legitimacy in our conversations about that. And so that's one thing I think that we have to be careful of, and I think there's also lots of opportunities with a lot of good groups out there that may have a slightly different perspective, but still want the same thing we do.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Flynn, Are there any known efforts or technologies to restore antibiotic sensitivity to previously resistant pathogens?
Wow, that's a tough one. I just got that question. Yeah, well, I don't know that I can answer that question. I think it would be certainly good if we could say yes, that we could sort of turn the tide around on products. But I think that the current thinking has been that, you know, once the horse is out of the barn, so to speak, you can't get it back in.
Get it back in. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Constance. Veterinarians have a huge responsibility for VFD, et cetera. How do you think we can increase their engagement and producer education?
Well, you know, nothing gets an individual who provides a service to their customers engaged in an issue more than having those customers ask for it. So sometimes I think a lot of it will be if producers understand something's going on and they go to their veterinarian for assistance on an issue, that you will see, more veterinarians, if they haven't already understood what's happening with VFD, will be kind of stepping in and doing some of that, or finding out a little bit more about it to provide that service to their customer. The challenge is going to be, quite frankly, having enough veterinarians to provide that service is probably the bigger problem and the bigger issue.
And so the supply channel of veterinarians as we go along. We have a question in the audience. Yes. And we'll get that.
Hello. So, Dr. Flynn, I have I can't really understand here the label on control and prevention part of the whole deal, because, I keep asking myself, is control and prevention really judicious use of antibiotics? Because if you really think scientifically, if you use antibiotics to control a disease, you're probably promoting the emergence of resistance. Am I thinking right there? Or? So I wonder, why is that label there, and if it's truly judicious use?
Well, so I recognize, I think that certainly is a concern and a challenge for us in terms of managing disease, particularly in animal agricultural settings, where, again, as I mentioned in my talk, that, inherent to that, we have clearly large groups of animals where risk of disease outbreaks, is always there, and there's a need to try to manage that effectively. So clearly, on the treatment end, when we, I think everyone can sort of clearly understand, because it's very relatable to what we see in other settings, is obviously you have a clinically sick animal, you need to treat that animal to, address its health issue. So, but in a managing disease in a sort of population of animals, I think that's where we do believe that. And again, it can be a little bit confusing. I think the distinction between, prevention and control is, in some respects, is in the way in which we label the indications for some of these products. Control really being a situation where you have, say, a group of animals, in a confined area, in a pen or a house, where some percentage of those animals are starting to become clinically ill, and you want to control that outbreak. And so you're treating that entire group, when not necessarily every animal in that group is actually clinically ill at the time. But of course, the objective is to bring that outbreak under control before it continues to expand. On the prevention side, in that case, the difference is that the animals none of the animals are necessarily clinically ill. But I think where we're, and I think this is consistent with some of the ideas that FDA has talked about, is that we believe there are judicious prevention uses, which is that based on risk, that if you have, and we believe that's where it's important to have veterinarians involved, is that based on history and understanding about certain populations of animals, where they're coming from, perhaps the distance they're traveling, a lot can be known about those situations where, based on past experience, those animals have broke with disease if the issue wasn't prevented or addressed. So In that case, we see a situation where prevention use or control use would be judicious, when it's, particularly when it's under vet oversight. You're targeting it based on the risk of disease. You're targeting a specific disease. And you're doing it in a way when you're administering the drug at a therapeutic level to address that disease. The potential outcome of not addressing the disease outbreak potential, either through control or prevention, is that you end up having a bunch of sick animals breaking with disease, and you ultimately are going to have to treat them, therapeutically, and so you end up having to use antibiotics in that case anyway. So I think it is a measure of, so long as we can identify, sort of judicious settings where we can use these antibiotics to effectively control and prevent disease, we believe that that makes sense as a way of managing disease, as opposed to allowing those animals to break, become clinically ill, and then having to treat them anyway.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the audience as we move around? As you think of something, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. In the meantime, should extra label drug use be eliminated? And then also, what is the appropriate or the legal approach to providing a VFD for minor use species?
So first, extra label use by law is permitted for veterinarians. This was established in law through the Animal Medicinal Use Clarification Act in the 1990s. So a veterinarian can legally prescribe or authorize the use of an approved drug, so either an approved animal drug or approved human drug, in an extra label manner, meaning for a use that is not provided for on labeling. FDA has authority under that same law to prohibit certain extra label uses of drugs, which in fact we have done. Fluoroquinolones being an example, a critically important class of drug for which FDA has prohibited extra label use because of concerns about resistance. But the law does provide for extra label use. There are a very specific set of conditions. There's a regulation that FDA promulgated that lays out a set of conditions under which veterinarians can prescribe drugs extra labelly. By law, the one place, the exception, is the law basically carves out the exception that extra label use provisions do not apply to the use of drugs in feed. So by law, that's not permitted, and that's not through FDA regulation. That's by act of Congress when they wrote the law that they basically carved out an exception that said this does not apply to the use of drugs in feed.
And then the other one was minor use
species,
and off-label use in minor species.
Okay, so a challenge clearly we face in veterinary medicine is the fact that, as I talked about earlier, we have many species. I mean, the list goes on in terms of how do you address all the health needs of all these different species. So the reality is we have a limited number of products that are approved, that have approved on-label indications to address all these different species. So the challenge in some of those circumstances is that for certain minor species, that they have difficulty getting access to the products they need. So in some of these species, feed uses, for example, are important modalities for managing disease in those species. Now, again, by law, because that's not permitted, FDA has in the past, historically, we have issued or exercised discretion under some very certain circumstances through a compliance policy guide that we published outlining situations where we would essentially not likely take action if a veterinarian were to use a feed use drug in an extra label manner in minor species, provided certain provisions are met. We intend to still provide for that flexibility, even despite the fact that we are, in conjunction with changing these products to VFD, again, because we do feel there are certain circumstances where, in order to address animal health needs in these minor species, veterinarians and producers may need to access the use of a feed use drug.
Okay. We'll go to the back of the room. Try again.
Thank you. Jack Gilbert, who's an environmental microbiome researcher at the University of Chicago and Argonne Lab, has been presenting data that shows there's a tremendous amount of microbiota exchange, including with genes for resistance between people and their dogs and cats, in other words, companion animals, partly because of the close proximity they're in. There are a couple of implications there. One is that small animal vets tend to use oftentimes bigger gun antibiotics that are more frequently used in humans than livestock vets. But the other one is that you're seeing with issues like the hog farmers in China, where you're getting colistin resistance for the first time in the United States. There's a concern there, and partly it's because of some of the practices where people are in close proximity to their animals, and we've seen that with some of the avian and swine flu issues as well, where some of the people who are in close proximity to their production animals have a greater probability of transmitting infectious disease. And anecdotally, some of the people that I've talked to at places like Kansas State and Iowa have seen that type of thing in state fairs as well. So I guess the question then is, if that's one of the major ways of transmitting antimicrobial resistance, are there things that we're doing in terms of possibly regulating in the same ways antibiotic usage and tracking them with metrics in some of the small companion animals? And in the case of livestock animals, what are we doing about these issues where there might be a greater propensity to transmit resistance by having close proximity? Because normally, you're not out there with a herd of cattle, or you're in there with a flock of chickens in the production facility, but that's one of the ways that you end up having problems with transmission of resistance to medically important human antibiotics.
Well, I don't like that one.
Constance?
Well, I guess just to comment on that, I think, certainly I think as Chris Braden mentioned earlier today, that certainly the significance of the microbiome and how we look at that information, is certainly something that's developing in terms of us, how we understand resistance and how we respond to it. I think in terms of other settings like companion animals and issues where certainly that is not a foodborne issue, but is one of contact and other sort of routes of exposure. Certainly, particularly from FDA standpoint, our focus for many years has been primarily on the foodborne pathway as it relates to use of antibiotics in animals, and primarily because our belief is, and I think it's probably rightly placed, that's sort of the largest segment, or where the most concern is. But I would say that, again, as I commented earlier, consistent with the notion of One Health, I think we need to be making sure we're looking across all settings, and I think that's one of the other issues that we need to focus a bit more attention on is, for example, companion animal and other areas where we may not be have not been focusing enough on at this point, and determine what other measures may we need to take, in that setting as well. So I think that's probably all I can say in response to that.
Right. I'll go to the back of the room again.
Yeah, Dr. Flynn, I'm not sure I understood your answer on Extralabel use in minor species. The point of clarification is, if we do not have an injectable product we can use, nor do we have a vaccine to use to prevent a disease in minor use, and a producer and his veterinarian know that, say, chlortetracycline will manage that disease outbreak. Well, that's only feed additive chlortetracycline, let's say, that has bylaws is no Extralabel use. But that's probably the only way they can manage that disease. It fits everything else under Amduca, but doesn't fit being feed additive. What is their course of action to manage that disease outbreak?
Sorry, I guess I could have been clearer. Our intent is to get specific guidance out on that issue before the end of this year.
Okay. I have this question and follow along with that. Given that chlortetracycline has been used in animal agriculture since the early 1950s and that it remains an effective disease management tool over 60 years later, are we certain that ongoing use leads to ineffective products in animal agriculture? So chlortetracycline and its ongoing use, are we certain that it leads to resistance?
Well, in science, certainty is somewhat of a challenging thing to attain. I mean, I think there's clearly we feel there's sufficient evidence related to what we know about antibiotic use that use is a contributor. I think the challenge we've faced with this issue for decades is how to quantify the contribution of all these different uses of different drugs in different settings to that issue of driving resistance.
We go to the back of the room. Is there a question in the back of the room, Katie? Is there a question? Okay. We'll go here. This one is, with the use of antibiotics in ethanol production, are we confident that there are not residual low levels of antibiotics in the DDGs and that we need to be concerned about? And who regulates that use?
We are aware of the fact that in the production of fuel ethanol, that in some cases some antibiotics are used as processing aids to manage the fermentation process. And we do know that a byproduct of fuel ethanol production, being distillers' dried grains, can be used as a feed ingredient for livestock. So we are aware of that issue, that there is the potential of essentially that pass-through of having antibiotics that are used in the fermentation process, potentially leading to some residual amounts present in the distiller grain byproduct. So that is something we are looking at, and recognize that, again, we're looking at all different potential sources that may be contributing to the issue.
Okay. In interest of time, one final question for you. What is the FDA's stance on the people who compound antibiotics and when there is a commercially regulated product on the market? I figured that'd be a good one to end on.
Ending on a high note, huh? Well, certainly compounding is fraught with complicated issues. I think clearly on the veterinary side, our preference is that veterinarians are reaching for FDA-approved drugs, or using drugs extralabelly according to the provisions that are laid out in the regulations related to extralabel use. And as compounding, I think, is another challenging issue we're working through, and recognize there may be some limited circumstances where compounding may be needed, but those are issues we are currently working on at this time, and it's probably as much as I can say at this point.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate that. Now, as we bring this to a close, I'd like to offer Constance an opportunity for some final remarks before we end this session.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of point out one thing that really hasn't come up much in the conversation, and that is that the whole the federal policy on the use of medically important antibiotics in food animals is not really occurring in a vacuum. You take a look at a lot of what's been happening in the market. The private market's been driving a lot of changes. I walk into the grocery store, I'm sure we all do this, and we see a lot of products that are labeled, raised without antibiotics. So I just wanted to raise that and point that out as a place where I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn. And some approaches that would be good to kind of really look into and try to pull some ideas and thoughts out as an industry on how we actually meet some of the goals and objectives that FDA and APHIS have. And that the other piece is that there's got to be some, I think, more dialogue and conversations about alternatives. I was on a panel for bio, and we were talking about the potential of gene editing and some other approaches to try to figure out how do you compensate for less antibiotics used in the production of agriculture, but still protect those animals. So just kind of two areas that I think are ripe for a lot more conversation and discussion, and figuring out how we actually take some of that and apply it to this particular situation.
Okay. All right. We want to take an opportunity to say thank you.